Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise in support of the McCain Amendment, and I want to, before I speak a little bit to the amendment itself, remind my colleagues of why this debate is so important and why the McCain Amendment is so important to this debate. Again, we're talking about a $1 trillion bill, $800 billion up now to $900 billion when you add in interest, $1.2 trillion and change. And it seems like every amendment that's been offered, and we've had a lot of Republican amendments that have attempted to cut out some of the wasteful spending, eliminate some of the things that I think are probably most egregious about the bill, none of which have been accepted, ironically. Ironically, the only amendments that have been accepted so far have not decreased the size of the bill, they have added to the size of the bill. This bill has gotten bigger. And I want to remind my colleagues again, because I think, and I think it's important for the American people to tune in, because we throw numbers around here in Washington in an abstract way, millions, billions, trillions of dollars, exactly what the dimensions are of what we are talking about. $1 trillion, Mr. President, if you took $100 bills and lined them end to end, you could literally go around the equator almost 39 times. 969,000 miles of $100 bills lined end to end going around the entire Earth right at the equator. Almost 39 times. That's what you're talking about when you talk about the dimensions of $1 trillion. And I might also add that if you look at where this is coming from, we're borrowing it. I mean, let's be honest to the American people. We are borrowing this money from future generations. Now, a lot has been said on the floor about who is going to get hurt if we don't do this, and I agree. I mean, there are a lot of people hurting. Unemployment is high. But frankly, Mr. President, let's think about the people who are going to be hurting the most, and that's the next generation of Americans who are going to inherit this enormous debt that we are passing on to them. Now, just to put it into perspective, between the Revolutionary War and Jimmy Carter's presidency, the United States of America borrowed $800 billion. From the entire time of the Revolutionary War to the Carter presidency, $800 billion of borrowing. We are borrowing more than $800 billion for this one piece of legislation, not to mention what comes next. We know we've got a $1 trillion spending bill, catch-all spending bill, coming at us, which is the first time that the discretionary appropriation bill is going to exceed $1 trillion. We know that we are going to have a request for additional monies coming from Secretary Geithner to stabilize the financial markets to the tune of several $100 billion. We know there's going to be a supplemental spending bill request for the ongoing conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. And ironically, according to CBO, the bill that was passed previously on S-chip actually leads to $41 billion of deficit spending. So all this spending that we're doing, all this borrowing that we're doing is being passed on to the next generation. And they're the people who are really going to feel the brunt and the impact and hurt the most if we don't do the responsible thing here today. Now, Mr. President, I think it's really important that this particular amendment that Senator McCain has put forward, a number of us are co-sponsors, be heard, a fair consideration be given, because I think there are several things about it that differentiate and distinguish it from the bill that we are debating, the Democrat proposal that's on the floor. And one of the most important distinctions that Senator McCain already mentioned is it comes in at less than half the cost, $421 billion, okay? So you talk about borrowing over $800 billion all the time from the Revolutionary War to the Carter presidency, the equivalent of what we're doing here, versus a much smaller approach, and in my view, much more fiscally responsible approach, and frankly, much more targeted. Because the criteria that's been laid out at the beginning of this debate for what makes sense in terms of a stimulus is it should be targeted, temporary, and timely. And what we have before us is none of the above. It is slow, it is unfocused, and it is unending. $140 billion of this bill are going to be very difficult to shut off because they add to the baseline. There's a lot of mandatory spending included. I want to also show you what the President's chief economic advisor, Larry Summers, said. He said this in the Financial Times on January 6th of this year: poorly provided fiscal stimulus can have worse side effects than the disease that is to be cured. Now, we've all talked about what's in this bill and all the spending that's in it, the $600 million for cars for federal employees, the money that goes into the 7 point whatever billion dollars it is here that goes into federal buildings, okay? All good things. Senator McCain talked about smoking cessation. That's all something that we support and believe in, but those are things that ought to be handled in regular order. Those are not stimulus. Those are things that do nothing to contribute in the short term to creating jobs and helping get our economy back on track. In fact, the CBO said that 12% of the total amount in the bill that we have before us would be spent in this year, 2009, and less than half in 2009 and 2010. So much of what we're talking about is going to be pushed off into the future when it's not going to do anything to stimulate the economy. It does create some jobs. Most of them are jobs here in Washington, D.C., at great cost. The State Department, for example, there are some jobs created over there. The average cost per job created at the State Department, according to this, is over $1 million per job. On average, you take $900 billion and you divide it by about 3 million jobs, which is the estimate of what this would create, and you're talking about $300,000 per job. Now, I might add, Mr. President, that the average annual salary in my state of South Dakota is under $30,000. Now, imagine how difficult it is to explain to my constituents that we're going to borrow $1 trillion from their children and grandchildren to create jobs at a cost of $300,000 per job. That's an awfully difficult sell, particularly when they look at how a lot of this money is spent. And we have some really requests from mayors and city officials around the country, and these are all good things. I'm not downplaying at all the importance of many of these projects, but there are requests here for 42 swimming pools, water slides, golf courses, all sorts of things that you can't argue that we ought to be borrowing $1 trillion from our children and grandchildren to fund and to support. And so, Mr. President, it's important that we have something that we can be for, that does in fact create jobs, that does in fact add to the economic recovery, that is fiscally responsible. And I want to point out, as Senator McCain mentioned in his opening remarks, some of the things that are in his bill. It is appropriately focused on housing because we believe, and I think rightly so, that housing got us into this recession. Housing is going to lead us out of this recession. It is focused on getting dollars into the hands of the American taxpayers. And whether you want to have the debate about whether you want to have government spend the money or the American people spend the money is a very simple one. I happen to believe that if you allow the American people to spend the money, you get a much better return. You get money back in the hands of Americans. They will help grow the economy. 2/3 of our gross domestic product is in the form of consumer spending. You provide incentives for small businesses, which create 2/3 to 3/4 of the jobs in our economy, and that does good things to help get the economy back on track. That's in this bill. Reducing marginal income rates, tax rates from 15 down to 10, 10 down to 5, cutting the payroll tax in half for a year for employees, gets money back into the hands of the American people so they can go out and help stimulate the economy and create jobs. It also, as was noted earlier, makes some changes with regard to the underlying bill where defense is concerned. We have some very serious needs. Now, Senator McCain mentioned in his remarks and talked about the defense spending in his bill, and there is some, frankly, defense money in the Democrat proposal, about $10 billion, mostly for military construction projects, but there is no money for reset. Now, we have serious needs out there. Senator McCain's amendment adds $7 billion for reset to repair military equipment and replace direct battle losses. $6.5 billion for the Army, $600 million for the Marines, $62 million for the Navy, and $83 million for the Air Force. It adds money for direct repair of military infrastructure and facilities. Things that need to be done that can be done quickly, that will put money to a good use, that does create jobs and serve an important national purpose. Now, the other thing that his bill does is it puts money in for infrastructure. Infrastructure, arguably, something that does create jobs out there if they're shovel-ready projects that you can actually get going quickly. I think that's a good use and in a reasonable way, not adding all kinds of projects that you're not going to do for many years to come. But if you're getting money out there that actually can help fund projects that can get done in the short term, that's a good thing. Unfortunately, much of the money in the Democrat proposal as I said earlier, isn't going to get spent out for years. Now, I offered an amendment last night not to fund new programs, assuming that it was going to take new programs a long time to get implemented and up and running. That amendment was defeated. But the point of all this is to do things that in the short term create jobs. $45 billion in the McCain proposal for infrastructure. And the other thing I'll say, which I think is just critical in this debate, because I talked earlier about how if we don't put some restraints or some safeguards in here, this thing is going to get, the spending is going to go on forever. Senator McCain's proposal includes a hard trigger that when we recognize 2 consecutive quarters of economic growth, of positive GDP, that this funding terminates. It is a fiscally responsible approach, an amendment that he offered as a freestanding amendment last night that received 44 votes. I haven't seen any evidence, Mr. President, in this chamber yet that anybody here is serious about adding any measure of fiscal responsibility or sanity to spending $1 trillion of our children and grandchildren's money. I think it's important that this amendment get a vote. I would urge my colleagues on both sides to support this amendment, to try and do something that is fiscally responsible, that reduces the overall size of this, that it addresses substantively the things in the bill, the shortcomings in the Democrat proposal, and do some things that actually will help stimulate the economy and create jobs. Senator McCain's proposal, Mr. President, is a much better direction in which to head with this. It costs a lot less, it does a lot more, and I think that I would hope that my colleagues will be able to support it. One of my colleagues on the Democrat side got up a little earlier and said, well, if it costs a little bit of money this year to do this or that, there isn't anything in this bill that costs a little bit of money. Everything in this bill costs a lot of money, and the people who are going to get hurt the most are the next generation who are going to be handed the bill. So, Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I hope that my colleagues will, in fact, support the McCain Amendment.